September 12, 1943. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The train slowed to a grinding halt beneath a sky so wide and empty it seemed designed to swallow sound. German prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, watching flat prairie stretch in every direction. Most had never seen land this open. The horizon offered no mountains, no forests, no familiar edges to contain the world. They had expected punishment. Barbed wire, certainly. Cold concrete cells, perhaps. Some had braced themselves for execution. What the Third Reich had taught them about American cruelty left little room for imagination. Surrender meant dishonor. Capture meant the end of everything recognizable. The train doors opened with a metallic screech. Guards in pressed uniforms waited outside, rifles held loosely, almost casually. No shouting. No blows. The prisoners descended onto gravel, blinking against September sun that felt wrong for this late in the year, too warm, too bright. They formed ragged lines without being told, muscle memory from military training now serving their captors. Camp Concordia sprawled before them like a small town that had sprouted overnight. Rows of white barracks stood in geometric precision. Mess halls, administration buildings, even what appeared to be a recreation area. The fence was there, topped with wire, but it enclosed something that looked less like a prison and more like a military base awaiting assignment. Lieutenant William Morrison conducted the intake processing with the same efficiency he applied to every task. Each prisoner received a number, a medical examination, standard issue clothing marked with large PW letters. The men moved through stations in silence, waiting for cruelty that never materialized. Instead, they encountered boredom. Forms. Questions. The mechanical indifference of bureaucracy. What unsettled them most was the food. That first meal arrived on metal trays, portioned and warm. Bread. Meat. Vegetables that still had color. Coffee that smelled real. One young corporal named Klaus Hoffmann stared at his plate for several minutes before eating, certain it contained poison or worse, some kind of trick designed to break their spirits before the real punishment began. He ate anyway. They all did. Hunger overrode suspicion. The barracks felt strange. Wooden floors, not dirt. Windows with glass, not gaps in stone. Bunk beds with actual mattresses, thin but present. Each man received 2 blankets, a pillow, sheets. The camp smelled of sawdust and disinfectant, not decay. Electric lights hung from the ceiling, switched on at dusk without ceremony. That night, lying in darkness broken only by security lights outside, the prisoners processed what they had witnessed. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the ceiling, minds working to reconcile Nazi propaganda with the reality of warm beds and sufficient food. A few whispered theories about American psychology, trying to explain kindness as a sophisticated form of torture. Klaus could not sleep. The absence of cruelty felt more disorienting than cruelty itself would have been. His last memory of combat was mud, screaming, blood turning sand dark. Now he lay clean, fed, unmolested. The cognitive dissonance created a kind of psychological vertigo. If the Americans were not monsters, what did that make the men who had told him they were? Morning came with a bell, not a shout. The prisoners assembled for roll call in the central yard. Guards counted them with the same detachment one might use for inventory. Then the men were dismissed to work assignments, kitchen duty, laundry, maintenance. No beatings. No humiliation. But there was something else in that yard. Something Klaus noticed only because it seemed so profoundly out of place. At the far end of the compound, beyond the last row of barracks, stood a tall metal structure. It took him several moments to recognize what he was seeing. A basketball hoop. And beyond it, marked lines on packed earth. A volleyball net. Goal posts that suggested soccer. The equipment looked worn but functional, like it had been used recently and would be used again. Klaus turned to the man beside him, a former sergeant named Otto who had fought in North Africa. "Do you see that?" Otto nodded slowly. "I see it. I don't understand it." Neither did anyone else. The presence of sports equipment in a prisoner of war camp made no tactical sense. It served no obvious purpose in breaking their will or extracting information. It simply existed, waiting. The guards offered no explanation. The camp commander, Colonel Harrison, conducted his duties with professional distance, treating the prisoners like soldiers temporarily misplaced rather than enemies permanently defeated. When asked directly about the sports equipment during a morning inspection, he responded with a single sentence: "Recreation is provided in accordance with the Geneva Convention." The Geneva Convention. Most prisoners had heard of it but assumed it applied only in theory, a diplomatic fiction that dissolved the moment actual warfare began. Yet here it seemed to function as genuine policy, translated into basketball hoops and volleyball nets. For 3 days, no one touched the equipment. The prisoners worked their assigned duties, ate their rations, and returned to barracks in the evening. They watched American guards occasionally shoot baskets during breaks, the ball arcing through prairie air with a familiar rhythm. The sound of the ball hitting pavement echoed across the compound like a language they remembered but could no longer speak. On the 4th evening, something shifted. A Red Cross representative visited the camp, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard who walked through the compound with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she had seen worse and expected better. She stopped at the recreation area, noted the unused equipment, and spoke directly to Colonel Harrison in a voice loud enough for nearby prisoners to hear. "These men need activity. Idleness breeds trouble." Harrison nodded. "They're free to use the facilities." "Have you told them that?" A pause. "I assumed it was obvious." Mrs. Pritchard's expression suggested many things were obvious to her that escaped military understanding. That evening, she addressed a group of prisoners directly, through an interpreter. Her message was simple: the sports equipment was theirs to use. Participation was voluntary but encouraged. Teams could be formed. Games could be organized. The prisoners listened in silence. After she left, they discussed this development in hushed German, trying to determine the angle, the hidden purpose. Some argued it was psychological manipulation, designed to make them soft. Others suggested it was propaganda, creating footage of happy prisoners for neutral nations to observe. Klaus thought it might be something simpler. Maybe the Americans actually believed their own rules. The next afternoon, during the recreation period, a young prisoner named Friedrich picked up the basketball. He dribbled it twice, testing the bounce. Then he shot toward the hoop. The ball clanged off the rim and bounced away. 3 other prisoners retrieved it. One took a shot. Then another. Within minutes, a dozen men were passing the ball, taking turns, remembering the muscle memory of gymnasium floors back home. The sound of the bouncing ball carried across the compound, drawing more prisoners. By evening, both basketball hoops were in use, and someone had retrieved the volleyball. Klaus watched from the barrack steps. He had played handball in school, before the war consumed everything that came before it. The sight of men playing sports, enemy soldiers permitted to play sports, created a strange ache in his chest, part nostalgia, part confusion. Otto sat beside him. "It's real. They're actually allowing it. Apparently. I don't trust it." Klaus watched a volleyball arc over the net, watched prisoners on both sides scramble to return it. "Neither do I. But I want to play anyway." That simple admission contained more truth than either man wanted to acknowledge. After months of combat, surrender, and the psychological weight of captivity, the desire to do something normal, something that reminded them they had once been more than soldiers, felt almost transgressive. The soccer field materialized over 3 weeks, not through official construction but through collective effort that emerged without formal organization. Prisoners marked boundaries with white lime scavenged from the maintenance shed. They flattened earth, removed rocks, created something approximating regulation dimensions though no one consulted official measurements. Goal posts were assembled from scrap lumber. The ball arrived via Red Cross shipment, along with medicine, books, and letters from home. When it was inflated, the familiar black and white pattern triggered memories so sharp some men had to look away. Friedrich Müller, the prisoner who had taken the first basketball shot, organized the initial soccer matches. He had played semi-professionally in Hamburg before conscription, and his movements on the field carried an authority that transcended military rank. When he called for positions, men responded. When he suggested formations, they listened. The first game occurred on October 3, 1943. 2 teams formed from prisoners, divided not by military unit but by arbitrary selection. Guards watched from the perimeter, rifles present but attention focused on the game. One young American private, no older than 19, stood transfixed as Friedrich executed a perfect corner kick, the ball curving through Kansas wind with precision that had nothing to do with warfare. The game ended 3-2. The winning team celebrated with restraint, aware that excessive joy might be misinterpreted. But the relief on every face was unmistakable. For 90 minutes, they had been athletes, not prisoners. Competitors, not enemies. Klaus joined the games reluctantly at first. His position in the German army had been medical corpsman, and his last memory of organized sports dated back to university. But muscle memory proved resilient. He discovered he could still control a ball, still anticipate passes, still feel the particular satisfaction of a clean strike. What surprised him most was the desire to win. Not for Germany, not for military honor, but simply because winning felt good. Pure. Uncomplicated by ideology. The soccer games became regular events, scheduled for Wednesday and Saturday afternoons. Prisoners formed unofficial teams, debated strategies, even created primitive league standings on a chalkboard in the mess hall. The competitiveness intensified, but the violence that characterized their previous lives remained notably absent. Basketball evolved differently. The American guards, many of whom had played in high school or college, occasionally joined the games. This created moments of profound strangeness as German prisoners and American soldiers shared the court, passing the ball, setting screens, competing according to rules that transcended national boundaries. Sergeant Frank Thompson from Oklahoma had played college basketball before the war. He possessed a jump shot that seemed to defy physics, the ball leaving his hands at impossible angles and finding the net with mechanical consistency. When he played against German teams, he showed no mercy, and the prisoners respected him for it. One November afternoon, during a particularly intense game, Klaus found himself guarding Thompson. The sergeant drove toward the basket, and Klaus instinctively moved to block. They collided hard, both men falling to the pavement. For a moment, the compound fell silent, everyone waiting to see how this physical contact between guard and prisoner would be interpreted. Thompson stood first, offered his hand to Klaus. Klaus hesitated, then accepted. They both returned to their positions, and the game continued. That gesture, small and unremarkable in any normal context, carried weight that neither man could fully articulate. It acknowledged something fundamental: on the court, they were players, bound by the rules of the game more than the circumstances of war. Volleyball produced the most unexpected social dynamics. The sport required cooperation, communication, precision. Teams had to function as units. Prisoners who barely spoke to each other during work details found themselves coordinating serves and spikes, developing the kind of nonverbal understanding that only emerges through shared effort. Colonel Harrison observed these developments with careful neutrality. He filed weekly reports with his superiors, documenting the sports programs as part of prisoner morale management. His assessments were clinical: athletic activities reduce tension, improve health, minimize disciplinary incidents. But privately, he recognized something more complex occurring. The men playing soccer on that makeshift field were not being rehabilitated or reformed. They were simply being allowed to remember they had once possessed identities more nuanced than enemy combatant. Mrs. Pritchard returned in late November, conducting her quarterly inspection. She watched a basketball game from the sidelines, taking notes. Afterward, she spoke with several prisoners through the interpreter, asking about conditions, treatment, access to activities. Friedrich answered most questions. When she asked if the sports programs were valuable, he paused before responding. "It helps us forget, for a little while, why we are here." "And why are you here?" Mrs. Pritchard asked. Another pause. "That is complicated." She nodded. "Yes. It usually is." The winter of 1943 brought cold that surprised even guards who had grown up in Kansas. Temperatures dropped below zero. Wind cut across the prairie with nothing to slow it. The outdoor courts became unusable, covered in ice and snow. Colonel Harrison approved converting a storage building into an indoor recreation space. Prisoners insulated the walls, installed a makeshift heating system, marked lines for a small basketball court. The space was cramped, the ceiling low, but it functioned. Indoor games possessed different energy than outdoor matches. The confined space amplified sound, made the balls bounce echo like drum beats. Players learned to modify their movements, adjust to limited room. The adaptation required collective problem solving, prisoners and guards alike figuring out how to maintain the game within new constraints. December brought a different kind of challenge. Christmas approached, and with it, memories of homes that felt increasingly distant. The Red Cross organized holiday packages, churches in nearby Concordia donated gifts, and the camp administration planned special meals. But the prisoners felt the weight of absence. Many had not heard from families in months. Letters arrived sporadically, often heavily censored. The uncertainty about what awaited them after the war, assuming they survived to see its end, created a particular kind of grief. The sports programs took on new significance during this period. Games became distractions, structured activities that imposed temporary order on emotional chaos. When Friedrich organized a Christmas Eve soccer tournament, nearly every prisoner participated, either as player or spectator. The final match occurred as snow began falling, small flakes drifting through security lights. The game went into overtime, and Klaus scored the winning goal with a shot that barely cleared the goalkeeper's outstretched hands. His teammates mobbed him, and for a moment, the celebration looked no different from any athletic victory in any normal place. Watching from the administration building, Colonel Harrison made a note in his log: prisoner morale remains stable. Athletic programs continue to provide beneficial outlet. What he did not write, because it could not be quantified in official reports, was the expression on those men's faces. The brief, fragile joy that transcended barbed wire and military designation. The reminder that they were still capable of something other than violence. January 1944 marked the beginning of formal league play. Friedrich proposed the structure during a meeting with Colonel Harrison, presenting his plan with the same precision he had once applied to military logistics. 8 teams, organized by barracks. A full schedule running through spring. Official standings, maintained and updated weekly. Harrison approved the request, seeing no harm in letting prisoners organize their own recreation. The league commenced on January 15, with an opening ceremony that prisoners themselves designed. They created team names, not nationalistic but geographic: the Hamburg Hawks, the Berlin Brigade, the Munich Motors, the Cologne Collective. Each team developed its own identity, rivalries emerged, and competition intensified. But the violence that might have erupted in other contexts remained conspicuously absent. Disputes over fouls were settled through discussion, not fists. Losses were accepted with varying degrees of grace but without the kind of shame that demanded retribution. Klaus captained the Stuttgart squad, a mid-tier team known more for enthusiasm than skill. His leadership style reflected his medical training, focused on health, sustainability, ensuring every player received equal time. They lost more games than they won, but team morale remained high. The Hamburg Hawks dominated early season play, led by Friedrich's tactical brilliance. He ran practices with military discipline, drilling players on positioning, timing, combination plays. His team executed set pieces with precision that bordered on artistic. Watching them play, it became easy to forget these were prisoners rather than professionals. Otto joined the Cologne Collective, a team that compensated for limited technical skill with relentless physical effort. They pressed opponents constantly, never conceding space, wearing down more talented teams through sheer persistence. Their style was brutal, ugly, effective. They finished the season in second place. American guards followed the league with genuine interest. Some placed informal bets on match outcomes. Others attended games during off-duty hours, bringing folding chairs to the sidelines. The distinction between captors and captives blurred during these moments, replaced by the simpler dynamic of fans and players. Sergeant Thompson organized a parallel basketball league among American personnel, creating explicit competition between guard teams and prisoner teams. The first guard versus prisoner match occurred on February 12, Lincoln's birthday, with predictable symbolism that amused both sides. The game was intensely competitive. Prisoners played with desperation to prove they belonged on the same court as free men. Guards played with equal intensity, unwilling to let enemy soldiers claim athletic superiority. The final score was 47-45, guards winning on a last-second shot by Thompson. But the closeness of the match established something crucial: parity. On the court, the prisoners could compete. They were not inferior athletes temporarily detained but equals engaged in structured competition. Klaus participated in the basketball league despite limited skill. His shooting was inconsistent, his defense mediocre, but his medical knowledge made him valuable for treating minor injuries that occurred during games. Sprained ankles, jammed fingers, the occasional bloody nose from errant elbows. He found himself treating both prisoners and guards, his medical training transcending the artificial boundary of captivity. When Private James Martinez rolled his ankle during a game, Klaus examined it with professional detachment, recommended ice and elevation, and wrapped it with the same care he would have provided to anyone. Martinez thanked him in broken German. Klaus responded in broken English. Neither man's words were fully comprehensible, but the exchange functioned anyway, meaning transmitted through gesture and tone rather than precise vocabulary. These small interactions accumulated. A guard who borrowed a soccer ball from prisoners. A prisoner who helped an American corporal repair a broken net. Shared water bottles during summer heat. The gradual erosion of otherness that occurred when people engaged in common activity without formal hostility. The league standings became obsession. Prisoners checked scores multiple times daily, debated controversial calls, argued about which team would win the championship. The investment transcended what seemed reasonable for recreational sports in a prisoner of war camp. But the investment made sense when understood as psychological survival. The league provided structure, purpose, identity beyond the reduction of enemy combatant. It created a narrative that prisoners could participate in shaping, unlike the war itself which had stripped them of agency and deposited them in Kansas. Friedrich's Hamburg Hawks clinched the spring championship in March, defeating Otto's Cologne collective in a final match that drew every prisoner and most of the guard staff. The game was scoreless until the final minutes when Friedrich converted a penalty kick, his shot precise and unstoppable. The celebration afterward was restrained but genuine. Team members embraced. Opponents offered congratulations. Colonel Harrison presented Friedrich with a trophy made by prisoners in the camp workshop, a simple wooden plaque with "Spring 1944 Champions" burned into its surface. Friedrich accepted the trophy with visible emotion. Later, in the privacy of his barracks, he wept. Not from joy at winning, but from the reminder that he was still capable of caring about something as trivial and beautiful as a soccer league championship. Klaus finished the season with his Stuttgart squad in 5th place. Their record was mediocre, but the experience had been profound. He had bonded with teammates in ways that felt more authentic than any connection formed during military service. They had argued, strategized, failed together, occasionally succeeded together. The league had given them language beyond nationality. When Klaus met former opponents during work details, they discussed matches, debated calls, anticipated the next season. These conversations occurred in German, but the vocabulary was universal: offside, corner kick, penalty, goal. Basketball season concluded with a final tournament bracketing the top guard teams against the top prisoner teams. The format generated controversy because it implied equivalence, treating prisoners and guards as equal competitors rather than maintaining the hierarchical distance that typically defined their relationship. Some officers objected. Letting prisoners compete directly against American personnel seemed to violate an unspoken principle. But Colonel Harrison overruled concerns, citing the positive morale impact and the absence of disciplinary incidents since athletic programs began. The tournament produced basketball that was simultaneously amateur and intensely committed. Players dove for loose balls, executed complex plays, competed with the kind of focus that suggested the outcome mattered beyond simple recreation. Sergeant Thompson's team won the championship, defeating Friedrich's prisoner squad in the final game. The score was close, the game determined by Thompson's superior conditioning in the final minutes. After the game, both teams shook hands, and several guards invited prisoners to join them for coffee in the mess hall. This invitation represented a boundary crossing that would have been unthinkable months earlier. But boundaries had been shifting gradually, eroded by the accumulated weight of shared athletic competition. Coffee was just coffee, but the willingness to share it acknowledged that the distance between guard and prisoner had narrowed in ways neither side had consciously intended. Summer 1944 brought heat that turned the prairie into something resembling the African desert where many prisoners had been captured. Temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. The outdoor courts became nearly unusable during midday, asphalt soft enough to show footprints. Games shifted to early morning and evening, played in the extended light of summer days. The schedule accommodated the heat, but the intensity of competition never diminished. If anything, the physical difficulty of playing in extreme conditions elevated the commitment required. Colonel Harrison approved a proposal for an intercamp tournament, allowing Camp Concordia to compete against other Kansas facilities. The logistics were complex, requiring transportation, security arrangements, coordination between camp administrations. But the potential benefits, improved morale, enhanced recreation programs, positive publicity, justified the effort. The tournament was scheduled for August, giving teams 2 months to prepare. Friedrich approached preparation with characteristic thoroughness, running his Hamburg Hawks through drills that would have impressed professional coaches. Otto's Cologne collective trained with equal dedication, their brutal pressing style refined through endless scrimmages. Klaus's Stuttgart squad, understanding they lacked the skill to compete for championships, focused on fundamentals. They practiced passing, positioning, defensive shape. Their goal was not to win but to avoid embarrassment, to represent themselves with dignity even if outmatched. American personnel organized corresponding basketball teams, creating a parallel tournament structure. The dual competitions, soccer and basketball, would occur simultaneously over a 3-day period at a neutral facility in Salina, Kansas. The journey to Salina represented the first time most prisoners had left Camp Concordia since arriving. They traveled by bus, guards present but not oppressive, the convoy moving through Kansas landscape that had become almost familiar. Small towns passed by windows, and prisoners observed American civilian life with the same curiosity Americans might have shown observing theirs. The tournament facility was a converted armory, its interior transformed into a multi-purpose sports complex. Basketball courts at one end, soccer field marked on the parade ground outside. The organization impressed everyone. Schedules posted clearly, referees briefed, medical stations established. 8 camps sent teams, representing nearly 3,000 prisoners total. The gathering created strange energy, enemy soldiers congregating not for combat but for athletic competition. They wore uniforms marked with their camp identifications, carried equipment, stretched and warmed up like any tournament anywhere. The opening ceremony occurred on August 10, with the tournament director, a Red Cross official named Mr. Robert Hendricks, addressing the assembled athletes. His speech was brief, emphasizing sportsmanship, respect, the privilege of participation. He did not mention the war, did not reference their status as prisoners, spoke only of the games ahead. Friedrich's Hamburg Hawks won their first match convincingly, 4-1 against a team from Camp Phillips. Their tactical sophistication overwhelmed opponents who relied on individual skill without coordinated strategy. Friedrich controlled the midfield, distributing passes with precision that created scoring opportunities his teammates converted efficiently. Otto's Cologne collective advanced through sheer determination, defeating a skilled team from Camp Funston in a match that required overtime. The physical intensity left players on both teams exhausted, but the collective's conditioning proved superior. They won 2-1, the winning goal scored in the final minutes by a forward who collapsed immediately after, overcome by heat and effort. Klaus's Stuttgart squad lost their first match but played respectably, keeping the score close against a team that would eventually reach the semi-finals. The 2-0 defeat felt less like failure than validation that they belonged in the competition. Basketball tournament followed similar patterns. Sergeant Thompson's guard team dominated early rounds, their superior size and athleticism overwhelming prisoner teams that relied on finesse. But a prisoner team from Camp Herne, led by a former professional player named Otto Schmidt, defeated them in the semi-finals, executing a zone defense that neutralized Thompson's shooting. The final day of competition drew spectators beyond participating camps. Civilians from Salina attended, local press covered the event, and Red Cross officials documented everything with cameras. The attention created pressure that elevated the stakes of what had been designed as recreational competition. The soccer final matched Friedrich's Hamburg Hawks against a team from Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. The opponents played a counterattacking style, absorbing pressure and striking quickly on transition. The tactical matchup created a chess match, both coaches adjusting formations throughout the game. The score remained 0-0 through regulation. Overtime produced no goals. The match would be decided by penalty kicks, 5 per team, the accumulated stress of the tournament compressed into individual moments of extreme pressure. Friedrich elected to shoot last for his team, a tactical decision that placed maximum responsibility on his shoulders. He watched as teammates converted 3 of 4 attempts, the misfire striking the crossbar and bouncing away. Camp Gruber converted 4 of 5, taking a 4-3 lead. Friedrich placed the ball on the penalty spot, stepped back, began his approach. The goalkeeper guessed correctly, diving left. But Friedrich's shot carried too much power, too much precision. It struck the inside of the post and crossed the goal line. 4-4, the shootout continued to sudden death. 2 more rounds of perfect conversion. Then a Camp Gruber shooter placed his attempt directly at the goalkeeper, who made an easy save. Friedrich's teammate stepped up next, shot calmly to the right corner, scored. Hamburg Hawks won 7-6 on penalties. The celebration was ecstatic but brief, players collapsing from exhaustion, heat, emotional depletion. Friedrich sat on the field, head in hands, overwhelmed by relief and something deeper he could not name. The basketball final occurred simultaneously, Werner Schmidt's team defeating a guard squad in overtime. The parallel victories by prisoner teams created a narrative that complicated the simple hierarchy of captivity. For 3 days, the athletes had competed on equal terms, and the prisoners had emerged victorious. The closing ceremony occurred at sunset, shadows lengthening across the parade ground. Mr. Hendricks presented trophies, simple wooden plaques similar to the one Colonel Harrison had given Friedrich months earlier. The symbolism was identical, recognition that these men remained capable of achievement, that victory could be measured in terms other than military conquest. As prisoners boarded buses for the return to their respective camps, Klaus overheard a conversation between 2 guards. One asked the other what he thought about prisoners winning both finals. The second guard paused, then responded, "I think they earned it." That assessment, clinical and unsentimental, contained an acknowledgement that transcended the athletic competition. The prisoners had earned respect through excellence, proven themselves worthy competitors rather than defeated enemies. The distinction mattered more than any trophy. The bus ride back to Camp Concordia occurred in near silence, prisoners exhausted but satisfied. Friedrich sat alone, the championship trophy resting on his lap. He stared out the window at Kansas darkness, processing what had occurred. They had won a soccer tournament. A recreational competition between prisoner-of-war camps. In the grand context of global conflict, it meant nothing. Strategically, tactically, historically, the Hamburg Hawks' victory would not be remembered or recorded in any meaningful way. But to Friedrich, to his teammates, to Klaus watching from across the aisle, it meant everything. It proved they could still accomplish something, still coordinate effort toward a goal, still experience the particular satisfaction that comes from achieving something difficult through skill and determination. The tournament marked a turning point that became evident only in retrospect. Prisoners who had returned from Salina carried themselves differently, moved through daily routines with confidence that transcended their circumstances. The shared achievement had restored something warfare had taken: agency, purpose, the belief that their actions could produce meaningful outcomes. September brought cooler weather and the beginning of fall league play. But the atmosphere had changed. The competition remained intense, but the stakes felt lower. Having competed at tournament level, regular league matches became opportunities for experimentation, skill development, enjoyment rather than proving ground for identity. Klaus noticed the shift in barracks conversations. Prisoners discussed games with less desperation, more analysis. They debated tactical decisions, evaluated player performance, anticipated future matches without the underlying anxiety that had characterized earlier seasons. Sports had normalized. This normalization represented its own form of transformation. The activities that had initially seemed so improbable, enemy soldiers playing recreational sports in captivity, had become routine. Expected. Part of the established rhythm of camp life. Colonel Harrison observed these changes in his weekly reports, noting decreased disciplinary incidents, improved cooperation during work assignments, enhanced overall morale. But he also recognized that something more complex was occurring, something his reports could not quite capture. The prisoners were developing a community. Not based on military hierarchy or national identity, but on shared experience of captivity, shared participation in athletic leagues, shared memory of the Salina tournament. This community crossed traditional boundaries, included guards who had participated in games, created social structures that operated alongside official camp administration. October brought news from Europe that made some prisoners uncomfortable. Allied forces had crossed into Germany. Cities that prisoners called home were being bombed, invaded, occupied. Letters from families, when they arrived, contained information that was increasingly difficult to process. Some men responded by withdrawing from athletic activities, unable to reconcile the pleasure of playing sports with the knowledge that their homeland was burning. They sat in barracks, refused recreation time, existed in psychological limbo between their present safety and their family's danger. But others responded oppositely. They increased participation in sports, used physical activity to process anxiety they could not articulate. Klaus fell into this second category, playing basketball and soccer with renewed intensity, seeking exhaustion that would allow sleep without nightmares. Friedrich occupied a third position. He continued organizing league play with characteristic efficiency, but his motivations had shifted. He no longer played to forget or to escape, but because he had become genuinely invested in the activity itself. The Hamburg Hawks were his creation, and he felt responsibility for their continued success independent of any psychological need. The fall championship occurred in November, Hamburg Hawks again defeating Cologne Collective in a final match that lacked the tension of previous encounters. Both teams played well, but the outcome felt predetermined. Friedrich's team had developed such tactical sophistication that overcoming them required not just effort but strategic innovation that Otto's physical style could not provide. After the match, Friedrich and Otto shared coffee in the mess hall, discussing the game with the analytical detachment of professionals reviewing film. Their conversation covered positioning errors, tactical adjustments, individual performances. They could have been coaches in any normal league in any normal place. Klaus joined them, carrying a medical kit because Otto had suffered a minor ankle strain during the match. As Klaus wrapped the ankle, the three men sat in comfortable silence, the kind that emerges between people who have spent sufficient time together that constant conversation becomes unnecessary. "Do you think about after?" Otto asked suddenly. The question hung in the air. Klaus finished wrapping the ankle before responding. "After the war. After we leave here." Friedrich stared into his coffee. "Every day." "And what do you think?" Otto pressed. A long pause. Then Friedrich answered honestly, "I think I will miss this place." The admission shocked even Friedrich himself. But once spoken, it could not be retracted. The truth of it resonated in the silence that followed. Despite everything, despite the barbed wire and the guards and the fundamental wrongness of being imprisoned, Camp Concordia had become something approaching home. The athletic programs had created routine, community, purpose. The men had developed friendships, rivalries, shared history. They had experienced genuine achievement, moments of joy, the satisfaction of excelling at something that mattered to them even if it mattered to no one else. Klaus understood what Friedrich meant. He had experienced more authentic human connection in this prisoner of war camp than in 3 years of military service. The bonds formed through athletic competition felt more genuine than those created by warfare, because they emerged from choice rather than coercion. "We should be ashamed to feel this way," Otto said quietly. "Perhaps," Friedrich responded. "But I am not." The conversation ended there, each man returning to private contemplation. But the acknowledgement lingered. They had been transformed by their captivity, not broken but changed in ways that would persist long after the gates opened. December brought the second Christmas in camp. The Red Cross organized another holiday celebration, complete with special meals, gifts from local churches, decorations that transformed barracks into something almost festive. The prisoners participated with genuine enthusiasm, having shed the suspicion that had characterized their first Christmas. Christmas Eve soccer match became a tradition, though this year's game felt different. The competition was gentler, more playful. Players attempted elaborate tricks, laughed at mistakes, celebrated goals with theatrical exaggeration. The game became entertainment rather than competition, performance rather than test. Watching from the sidelines, Sergeant Thompson commented to Colonel Harrison, "They've gotten comfortable." Harrison nodded. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know. Seems like we're supposed to be holding them, not hosting them." Harrison considered this. "We're following Geneva Convention guidelines. Recreation is specified." "That's not what I mean." Harrison understood exactly what Thompson meant. The line between detention and cohabitation had blurred to the point of near invisibility. The prisoners were not guests, but they were no longer quite prisoners either. They occupied a liminal space that existing categories could not adequately describe. But Harrison saw no benefit in addressing this ambiguity. The camp functioned smoothly. Morale remained high. Incidents were minimal. Whatever psychological complexity had emerged from allowing enemy soldiers to play sports together seemed preferable to the alternative of forcing them into rigid hierarchical submission. The new year arrived quietly. 1945 brought the promise of ending, though when and how remained uncertain. Prisoners followed war news when they could access it, understanding that Allied victory was inevitable even if the timeline remained unclear. The Spring League commenced in February, but participation was noticeably reduced. Some prisoners had been transferred to other camps, part of administrative shuffling that responded to changing war conditions. Others had simply lost interest, their attention shifting to thoughts of what would come after. But the core participants remained committed. Friedrich ran the Hamburg Hawks through another season, though their dominance was challenged by a new team composed of recently transferred prisoners from a camp in Arizona. These men brought different playing styles, created tactical problems Friedrich's team had to solve through adaptation rather than simply executing familiar patterns. Klaus continued playing for Stuttgart squad, but his role had evolved. He served primarily as coach now, his playing time limited by increasing focus on medical duties. More prisoners were falling ill, not from mistreatment but from the psychological toll of waiting, of existing in suspended animation while the world beyond the wire fence resolved their future. The spring championship occurred in April, won by the Arizona transfer team in an upset that Friedrich accepted with surprising grace. After the match, he congratulated the opposing captain, offered tactical advice for maintaining team cohesion, passed along the institutional knowledge he had accumulated over 2 years of managing competitive soccer in captivity. That gesture of mentorship represented perhaps the clearest evidence of transformation. Friedrich was no longer playing to prove anything or to escape anything. He had become invested in the community itself, in ensuring its continuation beyond his personal participation. May 7, 1945. The announcement came through official channels, delivered by Colonel Harrison to assembled prisoners during evening roll call. Germany had surrendered. The European war was over. Unconditional capitulation had been signed. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. Silence greeted the news. Prisoners stood in formation, processing information that seemed simultaneously inevitable and impossible. Germany, defeated. Utterly and completely defeated. Everything they had been told about superior willpower and destiny had dissolved into historical fact, they had lost. Harrison dismissed them without ceremony. The men dispersed to barracks, moving slowly, speaking in whispers. Some wept. Others sat motionless. A few laughed, the sound brittle and strange. Klaus sat on his bunk, staring at the wall. Germany had surrendered. His family lived in Stuttgart, which he knew had been bombed repeatedly. Were they alive? Had they survived? Would he ever see them again? The questions multiplied faster than answers could emerge. What happened now? Would they be sent home? Kept imprisoned? Tried for war crimes? The Geneva Convention addressed treatment of prisoners during active conflict, but what governed their status after surrender? Friedrich found Klaus an hour later, still sitting motionless. He sat beside him without speaking, and they remained that way for several minutes before Klaus finally asked, "What do we do now?" Friedrich had no answer. None of them did. The days following the surrender announcement felt suspended, time passing without clear direction. Prisoners continued their assigned work details, ate their meals, attended roll calls. But the familiar routines felt hollow, actions performed from habit rather than purpose. The athletic league stopped. Not officially discontinued, but no one organized games. The soccer field remained empty, basketball hoops unused. The equipment that had occupied such central importance for 2 years suddenly seemed trivial, meaningless in the context of total defeat. Otto sat in the mess hall one morning, staring at the chalkboard that still displayed the incomplete spring standings. Someone had added a single line of text beneath the scores. What was the point? The question had no good answer. Had they been playing soccer to escape reality, they had failed. Reality had arrived anyway, undeniable and absolute. Had they been playing to maintain sanity, perhaps they had succeeded, but the cost felt unclear now. Klaus returned to full-time medical duties, treating prisoners who were not physically ill but suffering from psychological collapse. Depression manifested in various forms: inability to eat, compulsive sleeping, catatonic staring. The human mind, it turned out, could only sustain uncertainty for so long before fragmenting. But slowly, gradually, a different response emerged. Some prisoners began using recreation time again. Not for organized competition, but simply for activity. They shot baskets alone, kicked soccer balls against barracks walls, engaged in physical movement that required no justification beyond the need to do something other than sit and wait. Friedrich was one of the first to return to the field. Klaus found him there one evening, practicing free kicks with methodical precision. Ball placement, approach angle, contact point, follow through. Over and over, the same motion refined toward perfection. Klaus watched for several minutes before asking, why? Friedrich didn't stop practicing. Because I don't know what else to do. The war is over. For now. Yes. Klaus considered this. Do you think there will be another? Probably. Friedrich lined up another kick. But not for us. We'll be too old. The ball curled perfectly into the upper corner of the goal. Friedrich retrieved it, set up again. Klaus joined him, serving as goalkeeper. They spent an hour in wordless practice, the familiar rhythm of athletic training providing structure that nothing else could. Other prisoners noticed and began joining. Not for formal matches, but for practice, skill development, the simple pleasure of physical competence. The Hamburg Hawks reassembled gradually, running drills not because they were preparing for competition but because the drills themselves had become comforting. June brought official news about repatriation. Prisoners would be returned to Germany in stages, beginning in August. The process would take months, possibly years. They would be screened, classified, cleared or detained based on military records and suspected involvement in war crimes. The certainty of eventual release changed the atmosphere. Hope replaced despair, though anxiety remained. What Germany would they be returning to? The letters that arrived, when they arrived, described devastation. Cities in ruins. Infrastructure destroyed. Millions displaced. Food scarce. Klaus received a letter from his sister in late June. His parents had survived the war, though their home had been destroyed by bombing. They were living with relatives in the countryside, waiting for word about Klaus's fate. The letter contained no recrimination, no judgment about his surrender. Only relief that he was alive. He read the letter 3 times, then sat on his bunk and wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming complexity of survival. He had lived. His family had lived. Germany had not. The summer leagues resumed in July, organized not by compulsion but by request from prisoners who wanted the routine one final time. The competition was gentler, the stakes non-existent, but participation was higher than it had been in months. Men played because they wanted to remember this as the end of their time at Camp Concordia, not the surrender announcement. Friedrich's Hamburg Hawks did not dominate this final season. The team was broken up by pending repatriation schedules, key players transferred to processing centers. But Friedrich continued coaching whoever remained, teaching fundamentals to new players who would likely never use them after leaving camp. Klaus asked him why he bothered. Friedrich's response was simple, because someone taught me. The final match at Camp Concordia occurred on August 15, exactly 2 years after the first organized game. No championship was at stake, no standings affected. 2 teams composed of whoever was available played a regulation match in evening light. The game ended 1-1. Neither team celebrated or mourned. They shook hands, returned equipment to storage, walked back to barracks. The simplicity felt appropriate. The first group of prisoners departed Camp Concordia on August 20, 1945. Klaus was among them, processed through security screening that took 3 days. Medical examination, background check, verification of identity. Then onto a transport truck, then to a train, then eventually to a ship that would cross the Atlantic. He did not get to say goodbye to Friedrich, who was scheduled for a later transport. They had played soccer together the previous evening, one final match under security lights. Neither mentioned the upcoming separation. Some goodbyes were better left unspoken. The journey back to Germany took 2 weeks. The ship carried 2,000 former prisoners, packed into quarters that made the barracks at Camp Concordia seem spacious. Men stood on deck for hours, staring at ocean that separated them from everything they had known before the war. Klaus spent most of the voyage in silence. Other prisoners talked constantly, processing their experiences, sharing stories, anticipating reunion with families. But Klaus found he had nothing to say. The transformation he had undergone in Kansas felt too complex for casual conversation, too personal for shared narrative. When Germany finally appeared on the horizon, some men cheered. Others wept. Klaus felt nothing but a strange detachment, as if observing from distance rather than participating directly. The ship docked at Bremerhaven, and prisoners disembarked into a country that barely resembled the one they had left. Ruins stretched in every direction. Buildings reduced to shells, streets filled with rubble, infrastructure destroyed so completely it seemed impossible that civilization could ever return. Processing took another week. The Allied authorities screened every returnee, searching for SS officers, war criminals, anyone who might face prosecution. Klaus's medical background helped. He was classified as low risk, cleared for release, given papers and directed to a displaced persons camp where he could wait for transportation south. The camp was chaos. Thousands of former soldiers, refugees, displaced civilians, all waiting for bureaucracy to determine their fate. Klaus found a corner, sat with his back against a wall, and waited. 2 days later, he encountered Otto. The former Cologne collective captain was sitting in the mess hall, staring at watery soup. They recognized each other simultaneously, and for a moment, neither moved. Then Otto gestured to the empty seat beside him, and Klaus sat. "So," Otto said eventually. "Here we are. Here we are." They ate in silence. The soup was terrible, nothing like the food they had received at Camp Concordia. Klaus found himself missing American rations, then felt ashamed for the thought. "Have you heard from Friedrich?" Otto asked. "No. Different transport schedule." Otto nodded. "I wonder if he made it." "He made it," Klaus said with certainty he could not justify. They finished eating, parted without exchanging information about where they were headed. The friendship that had developed through soccer felt too fragile for this new context, too dependent on the specific circumstances of camp life to translate into the chaos of post-war Germany. Klaus reached Stuttgart 3 weeks later, traveling by train, truck, and finally on foot through roads that no longer existed as roads but as paths through rubble. His parents' apartment building was gone, reduced to a pile of bricks and twisted metal. He found them living in a cellar 2 streets away, sharing space with 3 other families. His mother wept when she saw him. His father embraced him in silence. His sister, older now and thinner than he remembered, simply stared as if confirming he was real. They asked about the camps. Klaus told them the truth: he had been treated well, fed adequately, allowed to play sports. His mother looked confused. His father seemed relieved. Neither quite believed him, but neither pressed for details that might complicate the narrative of his survival. Klaus found work as a medical assistant, helping treat the wounded and sick who overwhelmed Stuttgart's remaining hospital. The work was brutal, endless, often hopeless. But it gave him purpose, structure, reason to wake each morning. He did not speak about Camp Concordia. The experience felt too strange to explain, too disconnected from the reality that surrounded him. How could he describe playing soccer in Kansas while Stuttgart burned? How could he convey the psychological complexity of playing sports with American guards while German cities were being destroyed? Instead, he focused on the present. Treating patients. Helping his family rebuild. Navigating the bureaucratic nightmare of occupied Germany. Surviving, which turned out to be more complicated than warfare. Months passed. A year. Klaus settled into the rhythm of post-war life, accepting that the world he had known before 1939 was gone forever. The Third Reich had been a fever dream, a collective madness that had consumed Germany and left only ruins. But sometimes, late at night when sleep would not come, he thought about the soccer field at Camp Concordia. The feel of the ball, the sound it made striking his foot, the particular satisfaction of a well-placed shot. The memory felt both precious and shameful, pleasure stolen from circumstances that should have produced only suffering. March 1947. The letter arrived without ceremony, delivered by postal service that had been re-established through tremendous effort. Klaus's sister handed it to him one evening after dinner, noting the American postmark. He opened it slowly, uncertain what to expect. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the English formal. Dear Klaus. I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing on behalf of Friedrich Müller, who asked me to contact you before he passed away last month. He was my patient at the Veterans Hospital here in Hamburg, and in his final weeks, he spoke often about his time at Camp Concordia. Friedrich wanted you to know that he never stopped playing soccer. After his release from camp, he returned to Hamburg and helped establish a local amateur league. He coached until he was too ill to continue. He said the time in Kansas taught him that even in the worst circumstances, people could create something beautiful through sport. He asked that I send you the enclosed photograph, taken at the Salina tournament in August 1944. He kept it on his bedside table until the end. With regards. Dr. Helena Schmidt. Klaus unfolded the photograph carefully. It showed the Hamburg Hawks celebrating their penalty shootout victory, Friedrich in the center holding the trophy. The image captured joy so pure it seemed to belong to a different world. He stared at the photograph for a long time, processing the news of Friedrich's death alongside the revelation that someone else had carried similar memories. The Hamburg Hawks had been real. The tournament had been real. The transformation that occurred on that Kansas prairie had been real. Klaus found paper and pen, began drafting a response. He would write to Dr. Schmidt, thanking her for notifying him. He would share his own memories of Camp Concordia, of playing soccer in captivity, of the strange sanctuary that the athletic programs had provided. But first, he needed to find Otto. If Friedrich was gone, the three of them would never play together again. But perhaps the remaining two could honor that memory by sharing it, by acknowledging that what they had experienced was significant even if the broader world would never understand. He discovered Otto's location through a friend of a friend, learned that he was working as a mechanic in Cologne. Klaus wrote him a letter that night, brief but direct. I received news about Friedrich. We should meet. We should remember. Otto's response arrived 2 weeks later, yes. We should. They met in Frankfurt, halfway between Stuttgart and Cologne. The city was still mostly ruins, but a cafe had opened near the train station, serving real coffee for the first time in years. They sat across from each other, aging men who had once been young soldiers, who had once played soccer together in a prisoner of war camp in Kansas. Klaus showed Otto the photograph. Otto studied it in silence, then nodded slowly. I didn't think I would miss it, Otto said finally. The camp? The games. The feeling of. He struggled for words. Purpose. Belonging. Something. Klaus understood. I miss it too. They talked for hours, reconstructing memories, comparing experiences, processing the psychological complexity of having felt most human while imprisoned. The conversation ranged across topics they had never discussed during camp: the war, the surrender, the guilt of survival, the difficulty of rebuilding. But they kept returning to the soccer. The matches, the practices, the way the games had created temporary escape from circumstances neither had chosen. The memory felt almost sacred, a reminder that humanity persisted even in contexts designed to destroy it. Before parting, they made a plan. Every year, on August 10th, the anniversary of the Salina tournament, they would meet. They would play soccer if they could, or simply talk if they couldn't. They would remember Friedrich and the Hamburg Hawks and the strange sanctuary they had found in captivity. Klaus returned to Stuttgart carrying that promise. He shared the photograph with his family, tried to explain what it represented. They listened politely but could not truly understand. How could they? The experience had been too specific, too dependent on circumstances that made no sense outside their context. But Klaus no longer needed them to understand. He had Otto. He had his memories. He had proof, documented in a faded photograph, that he had once played beautiful soccer in a prisoner of war camp and that the experience had mattered. Years passed. Klaus and Otto met annually, their ritual unchanged. They played when able, talking when not. The meetings became shorter as age accumulated, but the commitment never wavered. Even when Otto's health declined, even when Klaus struggled to travel, they found ways to honor their promise. Other former prisoners occasionally joined them, men who had been at Camp Concordia or other camps with similar athletic programs. The gatherings never grew large, but they persisted, small ceremonies of remembrance for an experience that official history would never record. Klaus lived to see Germany rebuilt, divided, eventually reunified. He witnessed economic miracles and political transformations. He saw his children grow, his grandchildren born. He experienced all the markers of a full life. But when he thought about the moments that had defined him, that had revealed something essential about human capacity for adaptation and dignity, he always returned to that soccer field in Kansas. The sound of the ball, the smell of prairie grass, the peculiar freedom of playing a game while imprisoned. In his final years, when friends asked about his wartime experience, Klaus would show them the photograph. He would tell them about Friedrich and Otto, about the Hamburg Hawks and the Salina tournament, about the POW camp that turned enemies into teammates. Some listeners were skeptical. It seemed too wholesome, too improbable that American captors would allow such activities. But Klaus had documentation, the photograph, letters from Otto, his own memories preserved with the clarity that significant experiences maintain. The truth was simple: in the midst of global conflict, on a prairie in Kansas, a group of German prisoners had been allowed to play sports. They had formed teams, competed in leagues, achieved excellence within boundaries of barbed wire. And the experience had transformed them in ways that warfare never could. When Klaus died in 1989, shortly before the Berlin Wall fell, the photograph was buried with him. His children thought the request strange but honored it. The image of young men celebrating a soccer victory seemed an odd choice for eternity. But Klaus knew what the photograph represented: evidence that humanity persists, that dignity survives even in captivity, that enemies can become teammates when given the opportunity to be more than their circumstances define them. The POW camp that turned enemies into teammates was not unique. Similar programs existed at facilities across the United States during World War II. Thousands of prisoners participated in athletic leagues, formed teams, competed in tournaments. Most of them returned to Germany and resumed normal lives, carrying memories of that strange interlude when they had been allowed to be athletes rather than soldiers, competitors rather than enemies. The memories remained private, too complex to share with people who had not experienced them. But the memories persisted. In photographs kept in drawers, in annual meetings between former teammates, in the quiet pride of men who had found dignity in impossible circumstances. The games are forgotten now. The leagues dissolved. The tournaments unrecorded in official histories. But for those who participated, the experience remained definitive, proof that even in darkness, humans seek light. Even in captivity, they seek freedom. Even in war, they seek play. The soccer field at Camp Concordia is gone now, returned to prairie grass. No marker indicates what occurred there, no memorial commemorates the games. But the earth remembers. The wind remembers. And somewhere, in the fading memories of those still living who heard the stories, the Hamburg Hawks still celebrate their penalty shootout victory, frozen in a photograph that captured more truth about human nature than any history book could contain.